And one.
Minu Ilam Makswait. Welcome everybody to our 5th season of Learning with Syeyutsus. My name is Ted Cadwallader. I'll be co-hosting today with my friend Stephanie Johnson. We usually co-host with our third partner, Tsumquatan, Lawrence Mitchell, but he is off today and busy doing all sorts of great work on our behalf in Vancouver today. Learning with Syeyutsus, if this is the first time you're joining us, this is a program and a project from Nanaimo Ladysmith Public Schools, learning how to walk this path of reconciliation and do reflective work on the territories of the Hul'qumi'num speaking peoples here on the west coast of what's now called Canada. So we raise our hands to our ancestors and relatives here across the Hul'qumi'num speaking territories. We're very grateful for this beautiful day that's sitting in front of us. I'm getting a look across the edge of the Tz'uminus territories to the coastal mountains here on the Salish Sea. And we are so pleased and so grateful to be able to welcome 2 of our relatives who've joined us in earlier seasons today. Dr. Marie Battiste and Sahaj Youngblood Henderson, 2 people who've carved a great path for us along here, and who are joining us today to talk a little bit about their book that you can get by going to our website, 20% off from our friends at UBC Press. And if you're joining us today from a Vancouver Island Regional Library up and down here on the West Coast, well, welcome so much, and thank you for joining us today. I was thinking about how to introduce the 2 of you, and oh my goodness, you've carved such a great path for us, locally, nationally, internationally. You've continued on this path too. Lots of our relatives have carved a great chunk and joined us before, and then have set those markers, but you too have continued to set markers for us to follow through all of this work around decolonization and reconciliation. And we're so pleased that you could join us here today.
Well, thank you so very much for the invitation to be part of today's webinar. And I'm hoping that by the end of our hour that we will have introduced ourselves as well as the book that we've had put together, and giving you a little sense of ways in which you might be able to implement or as to take it up into your own work and in your own thoughts. First of all, let me recognize the territory on which we are speaking in my area as well as yours. I'm speaking from Unama'ki, from the one of the 7 districts of the Mi'kmaq Nation. Mi'kma'ki is the larger territory of Mi'kmaq people, and we are in the Sydney area in Cape Breton, known as Unama'ki. And I want to recognize the territories in which you are located as well, some Na'mak and also the Hul'qumi'num peoples of the territory, and thank them for providing a important space for the development of Indigenous peoples' knowledges and heritage, and the discussion of that today. A little, just a tad about who I am. I'm Mi'kmaq, from Mi'kmaq scholar from this Unama'ki, from Bodladek First Nation, and I spent 28 years at the University of Saskatchewan teaching in the College of Education. And also we have returned to this territory after both Sygage and I have retired from the University of Saskatchewan, and have returned to really to return back to my family roots, to my family territory, and to renew and to maintain those relationships that we had. And it seems like everyone has a time in which they go away and grow into themselves, as well as come back and reflect on who they are and what they are, and to really raise the next generation in and through the wisdom that we have garnered over that time. Um, in the course of my career, I think that the most important things have come from an understanding of how my Mi'kmaq identity has been a inspiration in all the books and in the writings, and as well as in the understanding of the role that colonization has played in all of our lives. I think that it in the beginning years of my teaching and working with First Nation communities, it was really about understanding the role that culture had in our lives, and to try to get teachers to become aware of why it was important to us. And largely that became a kind of a cultural narrative, maybe even a language narrative. But basically, it wasn't until, I guess, the end of the last century that a lot of the discussion began to evolve around, as we were raising the attention, that it wasn't just a heritage and cultural discussion of inclusion, but it was a whole understanding of Indigenous knowledge, that our language embedded that knowledge, that our seasons and the ways in which we lived and worked with each other, and our relationship with the ecology and the environment and the animals and the plants and everything in it, was the knowledge system that needed to be maintained, sustained, and protected. In those early years, we worked with Indian Affairs, who said, we don't know, there's this big discussion at the national level about this thing called Indigenous knowledge. Will you do a literature review of it? And at the time, we were like, literature review? Where's the literature in this? But we took their money and ran with it, and did a very thorough search of all the documents we could find on this, as well as began to have discussions with people about Indigenous knowledges itself. And then from that, it became the first book that we came out with in 2000, called Protecting Indigenous Knowledge and Heritage, a Global Challenge. And that book was a little bit about the political resistances that we were receiving at the international level, countries that were not respecting Indigenous peoples in their places, and also not giving them credence to their knowledges, to protecting the lands on which they lived and worked. And so that kind of discussion led us to other discussions that, like the Reclaiming Indigenous Voice and Vision, which became the kind of like the Colonial Story International, as well as the understanding of the various parts that we were talking about, where we need to protect, and an opening discussion about decolonization that led then to my own aha moments, and the development of Decolonizing Education, Nourishing the Learning Spirit in 2013, that came from all my different aha moments, while at the same time recognizing that, that Eurocentric colonialism was a what I call cognitive imperialism, and that in cognitive imperialism was resulting in Eurocentric racism around the globe, in layers of superiority of one knowledge system over the marginalization of other knowledge systems, and what then the effect was that effect was having on individuals as well as nations around the world. And we were talking with Maori people who were beginning to work through their own language recovery and knowledge systems. And with that, we were inspired by their work with indigenous languages and the growth of it. And that became an important place for me to try to build that as recovery as well as reconciliation, as we were now working our way through an era of reconciliation in Canada after the TRC came out in 2015. And 2015 was a pivotal point in Canadian history as well. It was a time when not only TRC was coming out, but there was a lot of talking about indigenization at the university levels. And so we wanted to bring those elements together and try to find ways in which institutions, cultural institutions, as well as educational institutions, might begin to understand how to deconstruct their own colonial heritage as colonial markings in their policies and laws and practices, and then begin to bring in an awareness of the diversity of knowledge systems that existed and how we needed to balance those knowledge systems in and through education. And so our book, the more recent one now that we have just come out with, took us from 2000 to 2025 as a way to think about what happened before the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People had been passed worldwide in 2007. And so it needed an updating of the struggle and the tensions, and then the conclusions of how that then made its way in and to an acceptance of the international, on the international scene of UNDRIP. Once that was had, then it was important to figure out how to implement that. And so the work of Indigenous people from way back in the 70s, Laura Tate's mom in the field doing this early work, and I recall mine in the 70s doing that work and onward. And so we sort of represent a kind of an old warrior group of people who have been standing firm in our steel boundaries to make sure that our children and our grandchildren have the right to their knowledge systems, have a right to their identities, their collective identities, the right to their language, to their culture, to have the right to a knowledge system that is embedded in their ecologies and that is not just a physical form, but in its spiritual and cultural forms as well. And so what we've been working on is trying to make sure that that narrative stays on the forefront of our nation, that stays in the understanding of the law and politics, as well as in the educational fields, universities, as well as in the elementary and secondary fields. So it's been a huge explosion of knowledge to bring to a broader audience. But we've tried to combine it with different narratives around intellectual and cultural property, around sacred sites and the survival of those particular sites, of understanding our languages and the embodiment of knowledge that comes from the actual usage of that language and its communally activated learning in place, as well as the ways in which our creativity and our cultural knowledge can continue to evolve in its multiple forms in a dynamic way, and how policies and laws can continue to value it and then respect it and then protect it. So with that, I'd like to just turn this back to Saugage to carry a little bit more of that forward.
Yeah, thank you, Marie. Yes. Over to you, Sankaj.
Oh, great. It's hard to follow my wife,
Yes.
and I'm related to her by marriage, and we have children together and we live together. Um, I think one of the great stories about the Declaration is it's sort of a story that matches all the greatest triumphal stories of history. It's about a group of poverty-ridden indigenous people around the world who had been neglected for centuries, coming together to argue in the United Nations forums that they should be respected. And the UN had no category for indigenous people. They didn't know what to do with us. They shifted us from category to category, and we said, no, we're not minorities, and no, we're not that, but we're also indigenous peoples. And this is a great story. It's an epic story about a poor, uh, vulnerable people rising up to declare they have their rights. And right from the beginning in the UN and elsewhere, the battle was over this idea of inherent human rights. It was really unknown in the UN that they had, yes, a Declaration on Human Rights, and they said that these rights were inalienable and they were inherent, but really all of their human rights came from governments or monarchs. They were all delegated down to them as a privilege that became a right, but the rights were always limited. And what we were showing is that our inherent rights come to us from birth. They come through us through our what you would call the DNA structure of indigenous people. It carries with us inherently. And the Micmacs talk about it as the spark that's within us that was created at creation of the standing people. And other people say it's the fire within, and other indigenous people say it's the light within. But the important point about it is that it comes from us, it comes from within, it comes from the oral tradition, it comes from the knowledge that we'd acquired for centuries here and there, and the languages that we use to transmit this instead of written forms and some of the symbols and things like that, that we were adamant that no one gave it this to us other than our own heritage and our own ancestors and our own people and our own creation stories. And none of the other stories about monarchs and all the peoples there have anything to do with what we were talking about. The battle we fought in the UN was over this inherent concept of a human rights that existed without their permission, and all they could do was recognize it. We have the same battle in Canada and the US and other places. All of these nations in Canada are based on delegations from the Crown. All of the rights, even the structural constitutional rights, is made by someone else, somewhere else, and given to those immigrants and settlers who came here. The same comes with Canadian government and bureaucracy and enterprises. They all live under a theory of delegated rights. They're all incorporated with the Crown. They all have delegated rights. And so when we start speaking about inherent rights, they really don't know what we're talking about. And it spends a lot of time explaining it. And as I explained to Romano Saganash, who worked with us on the legislation, and also the Attorney General, David Lametti, is we don't need any statute to say we have inherent rights. This isn't delegated from you. All you can do is pass legislation that tells the rest of Canadians that they have to respect our inherent rights, that the legislation and the UN Declaration and our treaties, none of those gave us these rights. These rights came from our ancestors, our knowledge system, our heritage, and it's all contained in our language. And the more you know our language, the more you'll know what the constitution of these inherent rights are. So that was always a turning point in all the legislation, and even now in the UN Declaration Act of Canada and in BC, the government still think that they delegated this to us. And we keep saying, you didn't delegate it. You just recognized what we've always told you, and everyone has always carried with us. So we're trying to do this cooperatively with you, that all of this legislation is really a trans-systemic reform. It's not multiculturalism. It's not anti-culturalism. We're trying to say, we want to share the knowledge we have with you in a respectful way, and we accept that we'll learn something from you. But neither of us should be forced to assimilate to the others. And we're creating this trans-systemic realm that's never existed before. And we realize it's difficult. We've been through it on the sad part, and it almost crippled us, and we're still healing from the intergenerational trauma of being forced to be someone we weren't. So we understand that, and we're not trying to do this, but we were saying that everyone has a powerful and indispensable role in understanding each other's humanities from a respected place. And Canada is the leader in this in the world. No one else has got it through the Canadian legislature. It was halfway through in New Zealand, and then the new government came in and installed it. The United States has been stalling, although they accept Indigenous knowledge now. They haven't tried to move this through the Senate to get approval of the Declaration or any of the other human rights statutes. The really key provision of the UN Declaration that everyone doesn't really respect enough as they should is the first article. And the first article in the Declaration says that all the human rights conventions that's ever been passed and will ever be passed apply to Indigenous peoples. That covers us forever. And even though they may not say it in the Declaration, it's there, but we took our time to explain in at least 30 different Indigenous languages of the Indigenous caucus that tried to master the 7 languages of the UN to put our concepts into that declaration in English and French and Spanish and Chinese and Islamic was really a task of translation. But you couldn't pass a UN declaration without it being understood by all the language systems and being able to be translated. And that was a major thing because we were translating 30 to 40 Indigenous knowledges into the UN knowledge systems. But everyone's reading it in their system, but they're not reading it in our language. But we have the Mi'kmaq have translated it, the Crees have translated, the Ojibways have translated Declaration back into their language that we were working from in the UN. And other people like the Chickasaw Nation has translated it into Chickasaw. So it's now speaking in 2 or 3 different languages in every country, but people are still only trying to understand it in English or French. And that sets up a translation problem, but it's okay because we wanted our people to understand it in the way they should understand it. And so I think this Indigenous Renaissance has created, and what we had to fight against in the Eurocentric laws of the UN is that they wanted to say all of our knowledge and all of our culture, all of our language was a public or now a global domain. In other words, anyone can use it. And we were saying, no, it's not part of you. We never gave it to you. We never consented to this, that it's an Indigenous domain. We own the domain. We determine how it's translated into intellectual property, how it's translated into cultural property, how it's translated into traditional knowledge, and how it's translated into cultural expressions. All of that we have the ownership of because it comes from our ancestor and it's built in our language. And we have the spiritual responsibility. And in making the UN Declaration Act, what we had to convince the government of, and it wasn't too hard, is we said, well, where in your constitution that you got from the United Kingdom does it say you have any power over knowledge or culture? It's nowhere in the Constitution. If it's shared between the federal and the province, because it's not in there, it's also shared with us under Section 35 of the Constitutional Act 1982. And we've never given you permission to do this. And so you have to respect it. And so most of the talk about knowledge and cultural in the Constitution has been on language and education. And everyone forgets the important clause that we put into the charter as Indigenous people that is not respected is Section 22 of the charter. And Section 22 of the charter says there are languages that are not the official language of Canada that has to be respected in the charter. And those are all the Indigenous languages. And we've explained that many times to the federal government when they say, well, these are the official languages. And we say, yeah, they're official to you, but they're not official to Section 35. That's our inherent rights. And so we have to reconcile all those provisions together. And that's been the real battle that goes on continually when we try and implement the UN Declaration Act, is the bureaucracy still thinks so deeply on delegated rights, they start assuming that these are delegated rights and should be treated like delegated rights instead of be respected as inherent rights. And we're finding...
Maybe we could go to some questions too, Sajid.
Okay.
Sure. Thanks, you two. I like those pathways that we talked about, Sakash. You use the term trans-systemic realm, that third path that I find the organizations that we get to work with, and then I'm Ladysmith as well, and I'm Ladysmith Public Schools, trying to find that path where they're not appropriating Indigenous knowledge systems or Indigenous knowledge, but they're unsure how they can be reflective and honor and adjust their policies and processes to show some of the things that they're learning along the way. You talked a little bit about those implementation strategies, and I'm curious to learn a little bit more about those. Some success stories that you've seen along the way about organizations, not government as a whole, because I know that they're somewhat different, but organizations in and of themselves that have learned. I'm gonna say learn that the way that they're doing things might not be working out the best, and they've sought ways of doing things that are more reflective of Indigenous knowledge systems.
Yeah, there's so many in the government, and there's so many now in the private sectors that are just coming to this realization, is that the realization is about mastering and understanding through the consent of Indigenous peoples, their language and what parts of their knowledge they want to share. And that's the key thing, is they want to share it. They want their children to know it, even if they're in provincial schools. We find that the universities are the biggest resistance to Indigenous knowledge. They don't have any disciplines in Indigenous knowledge. but elementary, and because if they don't, all the teachers then don't know it. And I think one of the most exciting projects is what Marie's working on now, is that how do you teach history from Indigenous knowledge perspective? And this is it's in its few years, it's a 7-year project about how do you teach history from a new perspective, especially an Indigenous perspective. Marie, could you elaborate on that?
Yes, thank you. The project is combined with at the end is a project called Thinking Historically for Canada's Future. And it's really built upon a methodology of thinking historically, which is a developed by Peter Syeyutsus and several others who have been working on developing kind of what they call a science of history. In other words, instead of the grand narrative of of, of that you and I in the education that we know of, heroes and grand events that happen as per a nation's development. Cultural thinking historically is about unpacking how history is narrated, how it is contextualized in place, and recognizing that everybody has history. And so how do we then determine what every culture determines as significant in their cultural histories and so on? But as Peter Syeyutsus developed these 6 kind elements of this approach, what I was bringing to the table was this: there was not any Indigenous people involved in and developing this particular approach. So how do we now navigate Indigenous inclusion in thinking historically? And part of that has been, again, literature reviews and deconstructing some of the colonial historical approaches and methodologies and so on. But to recognize that Indigenous peoples' own ontology, their own way of thinking, their own worldview, carries time in a different manner, that it isn't a past and a present and a longitudinal look at these events, but rather history, as it with the Maori was what's before us and what we see, not in the past what we don't see. And so the elements of timing, context, as to how time is not a thing to which, but a thing that is part of the present and the future, and how important our 7th generation is as we think about the past and the present. So it's all contextualized within recognizing that we need to work with different notions of time that are contextual in place, as well as how important our teachings are, and those teachings are embedded in languages and are embedded in times we tell those stories. So we don't tell all the stories in and hope that people will remember them with some dates and people involved, but rather they will remember them in the context of doing, of recognizing what each season brings us, and how important it is that we recognize how seasonal knowledge is really about how we have learned all of this knowledge, and then how important it is to recognize how we are related in particular places to all things in it, and how dependent we are not only on everything that's present, but all the knowledge that helps us to hold that in place, because we're really working on not the present but the future. And so all of these things are brought together in that kind of relationship. And so I'm now really working with a lot of cross Canada dialogues with elders and knowledge keepers to talk about what history means to them and what elements of histories, how do they want to make known what is significant, and how it should be then put within a new framework. Or maybe it adapts the framework of Peter Sayce's work on thinking historically. And it's a blend, a trans-systemic blend of ideas that come together. So we're really doing a lot of work in terms of trying to think about a new vision, a new framework, bringing Indigenous peoples frameworks that are known. And I suppose Pan-Indian is problematic in some fronts, but we need to recognize that Indigenous people across the country all represent different kinds of ways of thinking from within their languages, but oftentimes they share commonalities and across those knowledges that we can bring together and offer in an English or French variation, something that frames Indigenous knowledges more accurately or more respectfully.
The other thing, Ted, is I guess the battle we're having with the Royal Society of Canada, that both Marie and I are members of the Royal Society, fellows they call us. And we, being one of the first Indigenous people with John Burroughs and a few others, we started saying to the Royal Society that you really don't respect Indigenous knowledge, is that we're members of the Academy, the Royal Society, for what we've done in Eurocentric thought, not what we've done in Indigenous thoughts. And you don't recognize the elders that we recognize and the language keepers and the knowledge keepers that we learn from. And so we started the conversation a few years ago with the president and the board of the Royal Society that they should have a special category for Indigenous knowledge, elders and knowledge keepers that speak their own language and carry on tradition. Marie can explain it in a little more detail, but they accepted it, but they're having problems with their own Eurocentric superiority about this. But we're making a little headway here and there. But it's the toughest audience because they're deeply steeped in the Eurocentric tradition, but it's one that we had to raise the issue in.
Indigenous knowledges at the university level have always been around Western knowledge systems, and to cultivate a place for it for Indigenous people, it's always been around cultural inclusion and diversity. And we challenge that notion that equity and diversity and inclusion be the way in which we bring Indigenous knowledges into the institutions, because it isn't about the people themselves who carry a cultural difference. It is really about a knowledge system that separates a whole way of thinking and a whole problem-solving approach to the world and a whole ontology or a way of thinking about the world and themselves in it. And so what we're trying to do is find ways to help institutions understand these different knowledge systems and how they reward or not reward people for the different knowledge systems that they bring. We do that in schools and in schools and universities as well, is that we say we want Indigenous teachers. We want Indigenous teachers to be in the school, but we only want to reward them based upon their Eurocentric knowledge that they bring in and how they activate that, not about their Indigenous knowledge and how they have learned that knowledge or how they are have to continually live in that particular culture as a way of becoming experts, as well as not experts, but to be culturally in tuned and aware And it is in being that they should be rewarding them for that, as opposed to how many books or chapters they write, or how many presentations they give, or all these other kinds of things that are really built around structures of Eurocentric education development, as opposed to Indigenous knowledge, awareness development, and expertise. So the Royal Society needs to rethink their own knowledge systems that they are rewarding, and finding ways to bring Indigenous knowledge holders to identify what expertise looks like within their own knowledge system, and who represents that for them, and why they should be brought forward as the experts in this particular field and be honored for that. And so our attempts have been put together in reports with the Royal Society, and now they're beginning to work with Australia, New Zealand, and Canada in terms of thinking through how they might utilize different structures. So, for example, in New Zealand, they've already have a structure through which the Maori knowledge holders who are in the society have crafted a way to recognize their own knowledge holders, and to recognize the kind of criteria of excellence they would have to measure up to in that particular field. And that, in fact, is how they have generated more Indigenous knowledge holders within the Royal Society. Mind you, I'd have to say there's been a backlash to that, as well, as backlashes are things that, within a very in the changing flux, there's resistances that show themselves, and so taking Maori off the board of the Royal Society of Aotearoa de Aparangi is the New Zealand what they called learned peoples kind of thing, and that particular thing is is an ongoing thing, and have taken them their representation off the boards, and that has effectively changed the quality of some of the ways in which it has moved forward. However, as with that, there's been more international efforts to include and make stronger Indigenous knowledge in Canada, as well as in Australia, and hopefully these will gather the strength to help other places like the Aotearoa's Royal Society.
Yeah,
I think one of the most important thing is that the Indigenous people are doing this themselves.
Yeah.
The government usually takes credit for it because they pass legislation or do things like that. But we've had some really good discussions with them, and we've really pushed them hard to get an Indigenous Language Act in 2019, and the Child Youth and Family Act federally that recognizes the inherent rights of Indigenous people and the right to self-determination, and also the UN Declaration Act that Canada passed and now has an action plan trying to go forward on. These are all really important steps, but they're only paper. And it's the Indigenous people who have had to carry the load of this, of the advocacy, of the attricia, the relationship between all of these things. And they've done a marvelous job in Canada an exemplary job that nowhere else has done. And they really don't get much credit for it, but I really want to highlight that we've changed the structure of Canada and BC, but it's going to take an exemplary effort from Indigenous people and other people to implement it and make all the BC laws consistent with Indigenous knowledge and rights, and make Canada's consistent with Indigenous rights. Now, we had this always in the Constitution clause that both federal and provincial laws had to be consistent with Aboriginal and treaty rights. But now we have a new consistency about the UN Declaration and our inherent rights. And that's going to make the long-term objective of reform so much more powerful. And we'll have backlashes because that's the nature of nature. There's different seasons, and people have doubts, and people start to fear one thing or another, and that's part of human nature that we have to deal with. But that's not a wall that exists, that's not easy to change through our own respectful advocacy and becoming intelligent about our knowledge and our heritage, and recognizing our own selves and our own validity and our own path toward the future. And I've one of the part two of the book has a little quote that's from a poet that said, it's an Italian person who said, "The future has an ancient heart." And we captured that very deeply in the Declaration and in the UN Declaration Act and the other things, is that the future for Canada is going to have a very ancient Indigenous heart in the end. That people are always moving toward that. They just don't know they're moving toward it because they don't know what they were moving forward when they came to settle here. And they just brought what they knew from whatever country they came from. But slowly the land and the spirits of the land are transforming them just like it has done Indigenous peoples. And that's something that's subtle and you don't see much. And sometimes they say, well, this is Indigenous peoples' knowledge. And we keep saying, no, the land taught us this. This isn't something that floats in our head that's not connected to the land. That this is all part of being and living on this land and having the land talk to you and you listen and understand the process of it. That we're just correcting the decolonization. We've moved from being negative and the racial critique to saying, what is the positive? And the positive now is the inherent rights that are in the Declaration, that we're carrying our human rights, and we want all settlers to have inherent human rights too. They don't have it at the present time.
And I would say that it's become ever so clear to us that, you know, in light of, you know, as I was reading the question in the chat, is that, you know, Indigenous people have lived with imperialism and colonization for a very, very long time. And their struggles and their resistance and their activism has been as long as they have lived. They have been resisting colonization and assimilation. They have fought the battles in multiple ways, in multiple fronts, in multiple blockades, and different kinds of ways. And we have a son who is a member of parliament and in the Liberal Party. And one of the things that, you know, as they came together and said, well, and what are we going to do about, you know, what's happening, you know, this new, you know, colonial imperialism arising, you know, and they were talking about that. and I said, you, this is where we know a lot about. This is the struggle we have lived, and this has been our experience, and we have much to share with you about how to address colonization, how to address imperialisms in its multiple fronts, and what to do and how to resist it in effective and ongoing, determined ways. And in a way, I think that's it. That is that we've had that experience of living and working in historical colonialism and imperialism. But we also have the strength of an indigenous knowledge system that we know has helped our people live through multiple kinds of not just imperialism, but environmental change that effectively changed the place of their living and the way of living that they've had from the Ice Age onward. So it's something about living in place in relationship with those who are in those places and trying to find ways to look at how are we going to survive as a people together, and how are we going to balance our futures with what we have at the present, and our knowledge and our languages and our cultures, our spiritual growth, our spiritualities are importantly part of who we are as people, and we need to move forward and balance and sustain them and maintain them. And we can do that in an interrelational way. And that's where, I think that the strength that we get comes from our very foundations of our knowledge system. And it has taught us how to be, as well as we're building upon that as a way of sustaining and maintaining for the seventh generation and beyond. And so part of what we do now is really to make sure that our children, grandchildren, and all those children in the world are going to benefit in ways by the knowledge systems that we hold on to. So that's kind of what I see as the important elements of how we move forward, as well as why we continue to exist and resist, and how we continue to aim for reconciliation and support and help in the balancing of our nations together.
I think a question that Joanne in our chat asked, I think that the things that you two shared will help her relate that to her students and the teachers that she deals with, to that resiliency and that foundational knowledge from our ancestors. One of the questions from Ella Winham in there is regarding the recent recognition by the federal government of Haida Nations' longstanding title to their own territories. What would you say cases like that and other title rights battles will do for the strengthening and sharing of Indigenous knowledge in the rest of Canada?
Go ahead, Syeyutsus.
It'll be great. It's a great process. It's a process that's been going on a long time. The Haida have been so resistant, so resilient in maintaining themselves through court decisions and lobbying with the federal government. It's just an exemplary model that everyone really reveals the art of the impossible, that what everyone thought would be impossible a decade ago is now reality. And that's happening all around Canada in different phases and different contexts. But it's all the recognition that comes from both the declaration of the BC government and the federal government of respecting their inherent rights and having nowhere to go, but having to make their laws consistent with that. And they stepped up and did this marvelous adventure and had the courage to go forward and say, this is who we are, and this is who we're going to be forever, and enter into these agreements.
Mm.
This is a different kind of agreement. It's a little bit different than the other treaties and things like that, but it reaches the same goal within the same kind of process.
And I hope that at one point, not only will people's knowledges be honored and respected, but also that the water, the lands having personhood be recognized and honored is an aspiration that we can put out there as what we next need to do. It is not just about people themselves, but indeed that the very elements that we depend upon need to be protected as well. And so the land needs to be protected as well as the water and the trees, all are needing our help to be protected as well, and to achieve personhood has been done in other places already. Do you remember where that was, Sagej?
It started in New Zealand, but it's also in South America.
Was that in Bolivia?
No, I think it was a little bit.
I think it was in Ecuador.
Oh, Ecuador, yeah.
Yeah. I that one of our questions came up too about our non-human relatives. One of the teachings. Oh, go ahead, Sakash.
I think that if you do First Nations laws based on the languages and our spectrum of animacy in the language, animacy gives you rights. And all life form has animacy. Not to everyone, but you have to be living in a certain way to have a relationship with another animacy. That is the same thing as what we do in Eurocentric law by saying the water, the trees, the forest, all the animals have rights, not just human rights. And that's part of the UN Declaration where we say that states have to respect the spiritual legacy of the land. That goes to all the personhood, all the rights in all the living creatures in the land. That our language at different times says they have rights and this is how you respect them, that they gave their lives so that we could live. And all of that is entwined in the language. And when you take the language apart and see what it's saying, you realize that not only do you have responsibilities for those animals and plants that gave their lives so you could exist, you also have a right to be a stewardship over them. And that's what we talk about when we say Indigenous or First Nations laws that are built into the system of Indigenous and treaty rights.
Right. Yes. All of the things that you both have shared with us today validate the things that Stephanie and I and Sunda, Laura, and Leanna, and all of our other relatives that I see in the chat popping up, that we're on the right direction. It's policy framework that the Naima Ladysmith is working to implement is a gift from our Indigenous knowledge holders here in this territory. They've shared stories with us. They've talked to us about our reciprocal relationship with the land and how everything starts from the land, how it was gifted us with the language, how the plants came next, so they know the most, and the animals came after, and they learned from the plants and the land, and how we came late to the game, and so we know the least about how to be here well. And if we listen back to that land where the language is embedded, we'll be more knowledgeable about how to be here together for the long term. I want to, again, I'm so grateful for the both of you joining us today. The long-term warriors that you are, like Sundak's mom, and continue to be here, gifting us with that resiliency and the knowledge that you've gained along the way. So on behalf of all of our guests and my beautiful co-host, Stephanie. Just want to thank you so much for continuing to gift us with that knowledge.
Thank you so very much for all of that. And I've been noticing the conversation. I hope you will send me the litany of the various conversation chat that I wasn't able to keep up with.
For sure. Yeah, we'll do that. And if people want to see the webinar again, because there's more knowledge in there that you might have missed, you can check the Learning with Syeyutsus website, and Stephanie will do her very best to have it up there as soon as possible for future generations to look at. So
thank you.
thank you, everyone.